once in a lifetime. She comes along and gives you love these days. Once in a lifetime. Once in a lifetime.
All right, welcome to Kyle2U. This is Kyle, and this is Brandon Reed, and this is our guest, Alexander Ingram. Today's topic is transgenderism. This is a topic that is becoming more mainstream. There's more awareness in the public sphere, which I personally attribute to, and I could be totally off base, but I personally attribute it to people like Caitlyn Jenner.
I mean, for me, I think like Caitlyn Jenner, Laverne Cox, and Janet Mock would be like my top three transgender people. Janet Mock is basically an activist. She's a journalist, and she just put out her memoir, Redefining Realness, where she talks about her transition to becoming a woman throughout her life.
All right, so let's start with the basics. What exactly is transgender? What is cisgender?
Okay, transgender is basically the idea that the gender identity that you identify with is different from the one that you were assigned at birth. So for example, I'm transgender because I identify as being male or more masculine versus the fact that I was assigned female at birth. Cisgender is just the opposite. It's basically if you identify with the gender identity that you were assigned at birth. So, when we have these discussions, it's always good to have a term for the opposite of what you're talking about, such as we have heterosexual being the opposite of homosexual.
Okay, so cisgender is people that identify with the gender they were assigned at birth.
Yes.
Transgender is people that don't identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Do you feel that hypermasculinity is a big issue for trans men in particular? This question is from Sar Green.
Absolutely, yes. Hypermasculinity in general is a problem for all men, thanks to patriarchy, but especially trans men because, we're forced into this way of presenting that the only way that we can be real men is to identify perfectly, to get every single surgery out there, to, pull on that toxic masculinity and to start treating women the way that a real man would treat them and stuff, and just basically perpetuating misogyny. And it's just anyone outside of that isn't seen as a real man. And so it's you really have to kind of be a feminist and to sort of want to work to take apart the patriarchy in order to be a trans ally, because a lot of trans men are actually quite feminine, and that's okay.
Awesome. Wow. Our culture in particular, as well as the Latin culture, have a very, although ours is starting to blur, but traditionally we have a very hyper-masculine society.
Yes.
And where men that aren't as masculine, thought as masculine, ones that don't play sports,
Right.
Has nothing to do with their sexuality or even their masculinity. It has to do with the fact that they don't like sports. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? But we have kind of lived in a society, and I believe that that's changing, where the lines are blurred. Their lines are beginning to blur.
Yeah, and I think the problem with stuff like that lies in the fact that, if you're seen as a man or if you want to be masculine, you have to do these things, otherwise you're seen as feminine and therefore inherently inferior. So really to be able to, talk about trans life and be able to sort of become more accepting, I think that we really need to break down the gender binary within our society and to say, hey, men can like feminine things, girls can like masculine things, and then, everybody can pick their gender identity and express it in the way that they want to express it, and nothing invalidates that.
Right.
So that, you don't have this sort of inferiority complex or anything like that, where one gender is seen as, superior and one is seen as inferior. You just see sort of gender more on a spectrum. Mm-hmm. Where people can pick their places and everybody's place is okay.
Right.
That's what we need to move towards.
Right.
Really.
And it's happening with sexuality too, in the fact that, you know, psychiatrists or psychologists and researchers, sociologists all know that sexuality is on a spectrum. It's not gay, bi, straight. It's you know, on this side of the spectrum, 100 times out of 100 times you would have sex with men as a male, which would be homosexual. On this the opposite side of the spectrum, 0 times out of 100 times you would have sex with a male as a male, and then everyone else is somewhere in between. It's not as simply black and white as gay, bi, straight.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that, and also I have to put a shout out to the fact that, you know, sexuality doesn't have to be purely about, you know, who you're having sex with.
Right.
You know, your romantic identity has a part in it too, and that can be divorced from your sexual attraction, and you might even not even experience sexual attraction and stuff. So, like, however you define it,
right,
it's all shades of gray.
Yes, and that's the problem with traditionally our society in general, is that we're always looking to define things with a single word. And the problem with that is that nobody can be defined in a single word.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at bromances, which is like a new hot term today. Yeah. Well, in certain cultures, that could be considered not the straightest thing in the world. And probably in ours, 100 years ago, it was probably considered that, you know? But today, there is a gray area which I think is becoming more acceptable, because people are starting to wake up to the fact that one word doesn't describe it.
Yeah, and I think in part that is also played into the fact that we are working towards having, you know, sort of blend the lines with gender binary, that we're starting to be a little bit more inclusive, because I feel like terms like bromance and guyliner, things like that, are sort of transition terms, you know, to get men comfortable, like cisgender men, more comfortable with expressing their, like, feminine side without it being deemed as, you know, inferior. So I feel like that's in part just due to our society transitioning towards allowing men to showcase their emotions, allowing men to be, you know, a little bit what we consider female,
right,
without it.
Right. You look at somebody like, are you familiar with Jaden Smith?
Yes.
Who is Will Smith and Jada Pinkett's son. He just did a high-profile...
it's like a photo shoot. He
did
the face of, I forget what brand.
It's a woman's,
traditionally
women's brand, and he's wearing all traditionally female clothes.
What we would consider
Prada or something, what was it?
Feminine.
Yeah, it was something, it was a major brand.
Woman's brand, yeah.
And to be honest, when I heard of it, it was my preconceived notions, and I'm like, what? And then I looked at it and I was like, this looks great. You know what I mean? Like, and then I'm thinking, wow, like, he's really cool to be brave enough to do that, you know? Because that does take not to but you know, it takes gravitas. Well, I guess that's the same thing.
Yeah, you always have to have your trailblazers to sort of, you know, be the first person to do that, to sort of take that step forward and say, you know what, this is okay now.
Yeah. And that circles right back to Caitlyn Jenner. To me, Caitlyn Jenner, I don't know why trailer came to mind.
Trailer Jenner.
Yeah, is kind of the biggest groundbreaker in the fact that this was a traditionally masculine man's man in the American culture who has now transitioned to what she feels like she always has been, and is now free to do that. Yeah. And, you know, the Kardashians are, like it or not, are huge influencers, and for Caitlyn to make that jump, meaning make that jump over the scariness of the potential consequences, was really brave. Yeah. So I can't hate on her for that. For lots of other things I can, but not for that. So that's, you know, I think that's really a great point. Hopefully that answers your question like 20 minutes ago. Explain what gender binary is.
Gender binary is basically the idea that our society, we want to, like, sort of separate and see things as black and white. So like we only have two genders, male versus female, in our society. And we attribute traits to either side of these genders. Like, you know, you see men as being the breadwinner. They're supposed to be non-emotional. They have to be strong. They have to be into sports. They have to do this, that, and the other. They have to be dominated. Or they have to dominate. Versus females who are supposed to be subordinate. They're the housewives. They're stay-at-home moms. They have to be maternal, take care of the kids, be emotionally vulnerable, you know, be subordinate to the man. And that's the society that we live in. That's the gender binary. But what we're, you know, starting to sort of figure out now is that there's so many other genders out there. You know, you have people who don't fit into that binary and, you know, either want to transition to live as a different gender or, you know, just don't identify as a gender. You know, you have like not the non-binary genders and whatnot. So like
I'm sorry.
We're really starting very, very slowly to cast that out.
So how many are there, and what are they?
I mean...
Or is it not so simple?
It's not really that simple.
Okay, all right.
Because there are so many different definitions because so many people feel differently. You know, there are different cultural non-binary genders, like the, you know, people who are Native American have two-spirit and whatnot. And that's sort of a way of saying that they have both male and female and that they're trans. But that's
right.
like a cultural thing. So like to say here are the exact non-binary genders, it's really, really hard to say.
Okay.
And people are always coming up with sort of new terminologies to sort of fit how they feel too.
And I think it's Thailand has like literally a third gender that you can pick from called like ladyboy or something. I swear to God.
Right.
Have you never heard of that?
I'm not sure, actually.
We'll put that
They could have
up.
thought of a better name. Ladyboy sounds insane if that's what it is, but
It does sound crazy.
Of India's third gender, and I've heard of...
Maybe, what's India's?
Oh.
It's like an Indian name?
I'm not sure
Okay.
exactly. I'd have to Google that. But, oh, and we just got a question from Sarah Green. What can I do to make my trans loved ones feel validated other than using correct pronouns and name? That is kind of a loaded question, I think. Because I think it really depends on the person, you know, and every trans person, like, sort of experiences dysphoria differently, which is sort of like the anxiety.
Body dysmorphia or?
Dysphoria, which there is a physical and a social aspect of it. And, you know, it's just basically the anxiety that we feel as trans people when we don't match up with the gender that we identify with.
Okay.
So there's physical and social aspects of it. And I think it really depends on the kind of dysphoria that your loved one, like, goes through. Because I feel like you can sort of validate them by, you know, reminding them about certain traits. Like with me personally, I experienced chest dysphoria. So I guess reminders that the fact that I have a bust doesn't negate the fact that I'm male is, you know, nice and is a sense of validation. So it just really depends, and you just have to be there and listen to what they have to say.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, I've seen quite a few men with big busts that probably should be wearing a bra, but that's neither here nor there. So hopefully that answers your question, Sarah Green. Back to what you were saying about gender identity and sexuality are not exclusive to one another.
Yeah, I would say that maybe there are some, like, correlations, like, enough so that we should still have the LGBT community, but at the same time, like, it's not the same thing. Like, I think a lot of people misunderstand that and they want to say, oh, you're trans, therefore you're gay, without understanding the difference between the two. And sexuality is basically, like, who you want to go to bed with. And gender identity is who you go to bed as. Is the best way I've ever heard it.
That is
it put.
really
and I cannot
good.
take credit for that. I actually read that somewhere, but I love using it when I explain that.
Yeah, that's
because it
awesome.
is literally the best way to explain it.
You just got a bunch of love for that.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Again, can't take credit for it, but
Sexuality is who you go to bed with.
Yes.
Trans is who you go to bed as. That is
brilliant.
a brilliant.
I want to say that's from Janet Mock, but I'd have to do a little bit more research, but definitely that's I think what's been sort of circulating our community right now is that definition.
I love that. What's a tranny?
Oh, wow. We should not be using that terminology. That is actually a slur.
Oh, is it?
So, yeah, it's historically used against trans women to sort of...
people really didn't know
no,
that.
it's okay. It's okay. I just want to let you guys know, though, that that's not really a terminology that we should be using.
I thought it was a T-Rex grandmother. Get it?
Oh, wow.
I
don't know how to respond to that. Tranny is historically used as a slur against trans women. Basically, just it was just something that like hateful people would yell at them.
So it's
so
equivalent
instead of saying
to...
they're like a trans woman, they'd go, "Oh, you tranny," and it's specifically trans misogynistic because it's for.
She said nothing against transgender. She was curious.
I know. I would say it would be equivalent to saying like fag or dyke against
gays or homosexuals.
A gay guy or a lesbian. Yeah.
I've heard trans people say tranny. Is that sort of like a take back the thing, like when gay people might say, "Hey, fag," or whatever?
Yeah, definitely. I think some of us within the community do want to reclaim it and use it, but I still think it's very much a loaded term that only really people within the community should be using as reclamation versus a terminology that everybody's using. Right,
like I was at the store and saw a tranny, you wouldn't, that's hard.
No, but if you see like online someone who is a trans woman using that in like her username or something like that, it can be cathartic to reclaim it so that people can't use it against you.
Right, okay, gotcha. Which makes a lot of sense. In the black community, that's a big topic with the N-word.
N-word, right, that's what I was thinking of.
Don't you think if it's a bad name, then no one should be using it? Again, I understand why people would want to, especially if they're trans women. It's sort of a way of, taking the power back. So, like, if you call yourself a tranny, then when other people do it, it doesn't hurt like that,
Okay, so
like,
it's a pain...
It's kind of like a shield, like... using it in a positive light to make the term more positive.
Awesome.
But again, there's a lot of controversy around it, so it's really hard to say. It's really about how you want to view the situation.
When did you first identify as gender non-binary?
Yeah, you can say that as outside the gender.
No, I'm drinking green tea. He's drinking
Red Bull vodka.
Oh, see, and we got hearts for that, of course.
Nice. Right. Oh, okay. When did I first identify? It's really hard to say. I feel like it was probably younger, because I've always been a person who sort of went outside the gender. I was always I was the tomboy, if you will. Basically,
you were the Robin Thicke. Blurred lines.
Okay, you don't identify as male, female. I personally identify as male, but also when I was exploring my gender, I actually started to identify as gender queer. So it was sort of I feel like I've been on sort of both sides.
I've seen this on Tumblr a lot. Gender queer. What is that?
It's kind of like saying you don't identify with either gender, and you want to be seen more as neutral or androgynous or sort of whatever combination of the genders that you feel is more
attributed to you. Okay, so I always thought that queer meant
I just got the question, you're a blend. Some people do identify as that.
That's a thing? A blend? That's a word? Okay.
Well, I mean, I don't...
It's like a term, or...
I wouldn't say it was a term, but you could use it to describe certain terms.
Well,
non-binary and genderqueer can be described as sort of a blend for some people.
When I think as you discussed, you talked about it as being like a spectrum rather than just black and white. The same way sexuality is.
Yeah, and that's definitely how I see gender, too, is sort of like a masculine, feminine spectrum, and you can sort of identify anywhere on the spectrum. You can be purely masculine, you can be purely feminine, or anywhere in between.
Can't all of us identify in some way with our non-assigned gender?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why it's so important for us to start sharing our stories, because I feel like there's a lot of people who think that they're cisgender when they are really like a non-binary gender and whatnot. But I guess to your original question, because I feel like I didn't really explain that, and your followers might be a little bit confused.
All right, so back to your original question about when you started identifying, when you started saying, wait a second, I may not be
Cisgender.
Yes.
I would say that was probably in high school, was when I really started to realize how far outside the gender binary that I was, and that I wasn't feeling, I wasn't identifying with my assigned gender. So I came out to like my close friends as genderqueer, being like, oh, I feel more masculine, but I'm not sure if I'm really a trans guy at the time. So I was trying sort of more like a gender neutral, a more androgynous. But honestly, I'd been like that my entire life. Like I was like a tomboy. I played with cars more than I played with Barbies, all those sort of stereotypes. I hated skirts and dresses, that sort of thing. Never really played with being feminine. So when I started college, I was actually like, you know what? I'm going to be a girl. Like I
remember that.
Yeah, I'm going to be cisgender, like I'm no more of this like in between sort of, I'm going to try this. And it was horrible. I was like so depressed. It messed up my mental health so much that I realized just how, uncomfortable I was with myself. And it made me really realize that I was definitely a trans guy. So that's what I identify as male now, and I'm using he, him pronouns. But everybody's different. Some people are totally comfortable in that sort of in between, mixing the genders.
Are you going through the process of becoming a male?
Yes.
Biologically.
Okay, that's one of the
because it's different between obviously the biology and between who you connect with as far as what how you feel your gender is. It's.
So you mean medical transition versus social transition?
Right. Exactly. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of an iffy question to ask actually, because for a lot of us talking about things like surgery and hormones and whatnot, it's very personal and it's very private, and it pretty much amounts to you going up to someone at a party that you just meet and being like, you know what, strip down, see it, like you're essentially asking about genitalia. So it is one of those questions that if you meet someone who's trans and stuff, like I would very much implore you to avoid.
Right.
I know it's hard because everybody's curious.
And I don't think that I don't think people are negatively curious.
Yeah.
I think they're generally,
I think
we're obsessed with sex and genitalia.
It's born out of curiosity, but it is very, the implications behind it can be hurtful too, because it's basically like saying, you know what, you need to have certain, certain parts to be considered the
true definition, which isn't true.
Yeah, I know most people don't think of it that way, but I feel like in order to sort of start to deconstruct the transphobia within our society, we have to look at why we're wondering about these things, and really dig down and be like, you know what, at the end of the day, what does this matter?
You're getting lots of love for that.
But if you generally care about someone, regardless of their circumstance, you want them to do whatever they need to do to be comfortable and enjoy life.
Definitely.
So why does it matter? Exactly like you said. When you go up to a party, let me take your pants off. It's insane.
I want to see your weenus. Right. Like that's
and I think you also have to take in mind that the majority of trans people don't have the resources to go through a full medical transition. We're talking.
I'm assuming it's.
You don't have $100,000 in disposable income. That's insane.
Yeah, you're talking about thousands of dollars there. So
which probably isn't covered by medical insurance. I would assume.
It's usually seen as a cosmetic surgery, so
like a lipo.
A lot of insurances don't cover it. In fact, this was actually a big thing. Was that just recently. The federal government added it to their medical plans.
Oh, that's awesome.
Their insurances now cover transgender-related health, which is amazing. But it's still slow coming.
Yeah, of course. She said, I wasn't trying to be offensive. I was just trying to understand. We know that, and Alex knows that. she's saying, so and us as viewers and us as public know going forward, if you just go up to somebody and meet somebody and they're, and for some reason that they're trans, not to be like, well, what's in your pants? Just because you wouldn't do that with, well, maybe you would, but typically you wouldn't do that. Brandon and I were talking about that earlier, actually, as we were setting up the studio for our special guest, and I said, we were talking about a cop or something. Brandon said, we were talking about it, discussing it, and Brandon was like, well, I think it's very natural. He said, it'd be like if somebody was dressed as a cop, you would ask them about, well, obviously you're a cop, which is, I think, is a general statement. However, and a valid point. However, the issue is that a cop is not your weenus or vagina.
Right. There's certain cosmetic things that you can do to make yourself look a certain way compared to your actual biology
clothing
and those types of changes. Right. Exactly. I mean, so it's different between cosmetically what you look like, what you choose to look like, and who you identify with, what you identify with.
Is that okay? Choose to look like?
Well, everyone chooses to.
No. I was asking
to what I choose to wear. You know what I mean?
Hold on. I just want to address, because we just got a comment that was like, just figured that if you identify as male, you would want to become all male. And again, I think that sort of thinking has to be unpacked, because again, it's equating maleness with having a penis and female with having a vagina, and what we really need to steer away from is that sort of binary thinking. That is the gender binary in its essence, is that you have, in order to identify with this, you need this part.
Right.
So, asking about like surgeries, asking about how far you want to go with it and things like that, like, honestly, if a person identifies with that gender and they say that they're trans and stuff, like, I feel like that's all that it takes.
Right. If I said I am a woman.
Yes.
Do I say trans woman or woman?
I mean...
Or doesn't it matter?
I would say, for clarification-wise, you would say trans woman right now.
Okay.
Just in terms of this.
Okay. So if I say I am a trans woman, you need to take me at my word. And she's saying, yes, but how would you know unless you tell me? How would I know unless you tell me? Which is a good point, because you see some people that kind of blur the line in regards to... you see some... She said, if I can't ask, how do I know unless you tell me? Because you will see some people in your life that have long hair, may be feminine, but very clearly are males. How do you...
I think there's a difference between asking about surgeries and asking someone for their gender identity. So, like, you don't want to go up to someone and be like, are you trans? Have you got the surgery yet? But if you go up to someone and ask, hi, I would like to get to know you. What's your name and what's your preferred pronouns?
Okay.
That's the proper way of sort of understanding how people identify. Because then they can tell you, and there's nothing evasive about that.
Right. Yeah, that's actually awesome. Yeah. I love that.